first met Dao Earl when I went to Spain in 2001 to join the Ecoforest Project, an intentional community Dao co-founded which combined low-impact living, permaculture and raw food. Since then, Dao has continued to refine his knowledge of food and nutrition, and in 2007 co-founded Sura Detox, a highly regarded retreat centre in rural Devon on the south coast of England. It's at these retreats that he has honed the art of imparting his knowledge via his illuminating daily talks. I started my interview by asking Dao about the evolution of his approach, specifically how he manages to so successfully communicate such radical nutritional perspectives.
Well, my own evolution coming into food in terms of understanding it has come from quite an insecure place, in that I was, like many people, looking for a way of being right in it, which is a very mindy approach, and that's what drives a person like me in the situation that I was in. And I found that when I came across raw food, it was just obvious to me that that was the way forward, because I had a bit of a proclivity for understanding things biologically and practically. So it was the obvious thing to do. And when I started doing talks on the subject, which was about 6 or 7 years later, I found myself, upon reflection, being quite zealous about it and quite unyielding. So I also started to notice at that time that unless someone was completely sold on the biology of it, then they would, like I say, they would balk against that rigidity, that almost religiousness around it. And it wasn't till I had my daughter about 11, 12 years ago, and needed to return to England to do everything that required, and started to let a lot of my own rigidity around it go, I found my new sort of more refreshing, practical approach, do what you can rather than do what you can't. It carried the message much better. And as much as anything, it was my own sense of relaxation and freedom. And one of the things that gets said a lot in my talks is that raw food is the biological obviousness of food, but we don't necessarily live in a situation where that's an easy thing to do. And so we have many reasons that we eat, and we have to incorporate in some way all of those reasons, because they are all pressures within us. So there's economics, there's social eating, there's emotional eating, there's all kinds of factors that have to be brought into account, and just the biology of it isn't enough to steer us in that direction unless we become rigid, which is it's just another unhealthiness as far as I can see. And so becoming more flexible and less consistent, I guess, in myself, I was able to give out a softer message which people can use more easily. So in my talks, I'm not trying to make raw fooders. That's the last thing I want to do. On the whole, I find raw fooders to be quite rigid and religious in themselves. And so I'm just trying to influence people to eat more raw than they were before. And if they can get above 50%, 60%, then they will feel fundamentally different, and their own experiences will start to guide them. And then I can step back and my job's done. They can carry themselves.
And what do you find is more effective in terms of trying to encourage or inspire people to do that? You know, is it the history of our human origins, and that, you know, obviously we discovered cooking late in our evolution, or is it just the simple explanation of what goes on biologically and physiologically?
It's very much both. I think people respond, even though they don't necessarily understand what all the words mean, they do respond very well to the biological approach, because it's got less opinion driven into it and more factuality. Obviously, there'll always be interpretation of the biology that we're seeing in action, but in simple, straight off the bat facts like, you know, what does every other animal on this planet eat? And why aren't we, what would make us so different in our physiology that we would suddenly require a completely different set of foods?
Well, what people often say to that is, well, you know, we are advanced, we're technological, we discovered fire, we are better, you know, fire gives us this, you know, advantage with food, it pre-digests it and so on. What do you say to that?
All of those things are obviously true and in many cases to be applauded, but none of those things have changed anything physiologically. We still have a series of very specialized chemical events which break down very specific compounds into very specific compounds that the body then uses. And any interruption in the flow of those things will generate a different effect. So, and the most obvious example for me is, if you bake a seed, if you fry a pumpkin seed, it doesn't then sprout. You have changed some of the chemistry there. And it may well be true. I know there's a lot of information out there, a lot of entrenched research out there trying to prove why cooked food has its advantages. And it may well be true that there are certain things that under the duress of heat become more easily released. But we must have always been able to get those things to build this big brain in the first place, because we've had a big brain a hell of a longer than we've been cooking. So it's not an essential part of our evolution. And we also know that cooking destroys massive amounts of nutrients. And so it's not to say necessarily that cooking is, the greatest evil that's ever befallen the planet, or any of these hardline raw food statements that I've heard. It's more about try it and see which balance works for you. We can theorize all day long, but I am backed up by 20 years of conviction of taking people into a more raw diet that feeds back the same information every time. People feel much, much lighter, much, much clearer, and much, much healthier, much more integrated once they start eating a lot more raw.
Has there yet been any mainstream or scientific nutritional studies of raw food?
There have been various attempts at it, and most of them are, I use this word entrenched a lot because we're trying to prove something contrary to the culture in which it sits. And so there have been a lot, many small studies, but when you say mainstream, it changes the landscape. So there have been several studies that have been done that have tried to look at what happens if human beings eat monkey diets, for example. There was a program on TV about 3-4 years ago where they took 10 or so many individuals and put them in a monkey cage in London Zoo. It had its whole sort of TV sensationalism angle on it. But it was very interesting. They didn't do it for very long, but they did it for long enough to start to notice some shifts in their health. But even their definition of what a monkey diet was, they were still making sure that they got what they considered adequate amounts of protein, for example, that's very shaky in itself. For example, the orangutans in London Zoo are given Horlicks drinks in the evening to increase their protein content. What? Excuse me? like orangutans in nature need to do that? It's just so entrenched. No one's doing clean studies on this subject. Everybody's so terrified about, getting it wrong and getting sued or whatever the motivations are. It's very, very scary on that level.
So what's everybody basing their their behavior on then? Where when people get frightened about lack of protein in orangutans, where are they getting this information from?
Well, most of it is studies that were done pre and some during the Second World War. So we have a situation in which, in our culture, a nation is very constrained in what it can feed its population. And so it has to feed its population quite heavy, dense foods because it keeps them full. And that's what really shoved to the forefront things like grains and meat and eggs and milk. And of course, the industries that produced those things were massively amplified because they were seen as part of the war effort of keeping our troops and keeping our nation full. And this is another entrenchment that we don't see anywhere else in nature, that only the human being attempts to fill itself up. All other animals eat pretty much all day long, and especially those that are more closely related to us, so the higher apes, all are eating food all day long, which means they're getting a constant inflow of nutrients. Whereas when you are just trying to fill people up, you are getting, they're doing it for a reason. The reason is that once you're full, you then can't eat for hours at a time. So you can work, which is an economic need. That's got nothing to do with nutrition. That's economics. But the thing that it does is it breaks, it recultures the digestive system into wanting big chunks of dense, heavy food. But the digestive system was never designed to do that. It can do it, and it can do it for years and years, but it starts to get exhausted. The other thing about how our closest relatives, and indeed all other animals, eat, is they tend to eat one type of food at a time. So monkeys will land on a particular tree and they'll just eat figs. While they're just eating figs, their digestive system is firing up the parts of itself that are needed to digest the components of figs, so sugar and water and vitamins and minerals. And they'll do that for hours and hours and hours. And then they'll move to a walnut tree, and their body shifts to producing all the components that are needed to digest walnuts, so proteins and fats more than sugars and water. And so while one part of the digestive system is working, the other part of the digestive system is resting. And so this is where the idea of food combining and trophology and all these very useful maps for describing better ways of eating, that's where they all come from.
So which species are you talking about there, and how similar is it to the human physiology?
Well, we can look at pretty much all animals, certainly all land animals, follow that type of pattern. They eat certain foods at certain times. And the closer, I mean, that sets the scene of a sort of general biology, but it becomes more poignant the closer that animal is related to us. And so when we come to monkeys, obviously they're a step closer related to us, and we find the same things are true. They eat all day long, they eat specific foods at specific times. And when you come from the monkeys into the higher apes, then that is more specific again. And there are 5 of the great apes left on this planet, and putting them in the order in which they are related to us, we have chimpanzees, which are the furthest away, then we have gorillas, then orangutans and bonobo chimpanzees, and then us. And bonobo chimpanzees are so closely related to us that there's a call in the scientific community to reclassify them as Homo, or to reclassify us as Pan, which puts us back in their species derivation. And that's because bonobo chimpanzees are more closely related genetically to human beings than they are to the other great apes. So this idea that we have, monkey, 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 ape, 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 and a huge leap to the human being just because we've got a big brain, you don't see that supported biologically at all. Our biology is fundamentally exactly the same as theirs. We've just chosen to make a couple of glands bigger in the body.
So what do bonobos eat? What's their diet?
It's predominantly fruit. Mm-hmm. And this throws up another massive, opposition to the standard idea of the human diet, in that all of those great apes have predominantly fruit in their diet, and then lots of leaves and a small amount of more fatty, more proteinous animal matter. So all of those animals none of those animals come from a vegan lineage, and therefore we don't come from a vegan lineage. But they eat relatively small amounts, so 2 to 5% animal matter in their diet, which is virtually nothing. It's there for a reason, it's essential, but it's, in terms of their daily fare, it's very, very little. You're talking, overturning leaves and looking for snails, eating the bugs inside fruit, occasionally coming across birds' nests, and very occasionally actually actively going out and hunting usually lower species of monkeys.
And roughly, 80% would consist of fruit?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. The more you go up that lineage of great apes, from chimpanzees through gorillas, orangutans, bonobos, and then to human beings, you find a greater dominance of fruit in their diet, and a greater proclivity of their dentition, how their teeth are made up to deal with fruit. So if you look at lower chimpanzees, they still have massive canines, and gorillas have fair-sized canines. But when you go up to orangutans, bonobos, and certainly human beings, our canines aren't pronounced at all. This tells us something about the foods that we were specialising on. which, as you go up that scale of apes, become more and more dominated by fruit. And that also would lend itself to another very controversial fact, that the idea that the bigger the brain, the more need there should be to have come up with that, in terms of Darwin's selection idea. You just don't see it. These great apes live in wonderfully predator-free environments. There's almost no predators in the canopy. Fruit and leaves are dripping out of the trees all around them all year. There's no problems to solve, no reason to have a massive IQ. And yet all of them have bigger brains the more you go up that scale towards human beings, and the more fruit they eat. And there's a very telling chemical routine that runs through that, but that may need to be saved for a later interview.
No, I wouldn't mind getting into some of that. But I just wanted to ask, though, so we moved away from that kind of diet 100,000 years ago, is that right?
That's the number that I go on. There is evidence to show that, there is evidence that people are interpreting as we've been cooking for perhaps 1 million or 2 million years through carbon secretions in certain parts of the forest where human beings were known to have inhabited for a long time. But that's relatively small areas around a much larger environment. And the generally accepted number around when we en masse left the forest was around 100,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And is it true the human brain has been shrinking in that period?
Well, indeed. This is another part of it. The fossil record clearly shows Neanderthals, which are, in some cases, or that some people would postulate is the step before us, they have a brain cavity of about 1500 cc. The average human being these days has a brain cavity of about 1350 cc. So it's a whole 10% smaller. And so that would suggest what the scale of apes fruit routine suggests, that the more fruit gets eaten, the bigger the brain is becoming. Take the fruit away and the brain starts shrinking again. It's all there in the fossil record, but we don't like to talk about it. We like to think that we are the biggest and the brightest and the best of everything because we've got iPhones and, satellites. But,
so you would argue that we had that high fruit diet for 120 million years, and then for the last 100,000, we've been changing and eating grains and dairy and everything else.
Indeed.
Yeah.
That's going to have an effect. That can't not have an effect. That's the thing to grasp. Yeah. And so inquiring as to what that effect might be, that's where I'm pointing people in the talks that I do on the retreats and all the rest of it. And everything that I can see in terms of biology, not taking away from our brilliance and our inventiveness that we've needed in order to populate the planet so extensively, but biology for biology's sake, it's been a major downgrade. And we're suffering from it.
Because there is an argument that says that, we've become so advanced and developed this brain because of the struggle to survive and solve problems. I think in that talk I saw you at, you said something about, wolves have had to adapt to their environment and they've remained natural and continued with their diet. Have I remembered you rightly, or got confused?
Well, there is that. Is it generally accepted at the layman level that we came out of the forest, had to stand up in order to use tools and communicate and hunt together and form more communal groups. And so we have developed a bigger brain over that period where we've had to use ourselves differently. And that idea of that's what happened to us isn't mentioned at all at the research level anymore because it's just got so many holes in it.
So many what, sorry?
There's so many holes in that argument because there hasn't been, straight off the bat, no one's been able to answer the question of how this massive explosion of cranium can have happened in such a short evolutionary time. Nothing has ever been seen like that in terms of evolution. 100,000 years sounds like a huge amount of time, but in evolution, it's a blink of an eye. And so that stumbling block has never been gotten over. Also, there's the material that we would have been eating in those states, in that environment, doesn't lend itself to big brain growth. So if you're hunting and growing grains eventually, that has never been seen in the whole of evolution to produce a big brain. There are no carnivores on the planet that have got more than a fist-sized brain because you don't need one. You can't build one out of the materials that you get from that. There's only 2 lineages of animals that have anything like the brain size that we have. One of them comes from a completely different wing of evolution in the oceans, the cetaceans, the toothed whales. They have a massive brain, bigger than ours, for obviously completely different reasons. And the great apes, they're the only 2 that have produced this massive great brain. And already a chimpanzee's brain, let alone a bonobo's brain, is massively more complex and adaptable and sensitive and intelligent than it needs to be to go swinging through the forest picking fruit every day. And
well, sorry to interrupt. Go on, finish.
Hang on, let me finish this. So why look at the predatory environment to explain the massive brain when we've already got our lineage growing this big brain in the forest?
Exactly.
That's the best place to look.
Especially if, as you say, we've seen a shrinkage of the brain in this period that we've been out there in the world, problem solving and hunting and everything else. Yeah.
There you go.
Anything to learn from the cetaceans, the dolphins and so on, and how they've developed their brains?
Well, people that are proposing the aquatic ape theory, the idea that we came out of the forest and settled on the shorelines where we've got masses of fish and therefore fish oils, which are one of the things that you can use to build a brain. They postulate that cetaceans are the best example of what happens when you have lots of fish oils available to you that you can build a big brain from. But again, you know, none of the other fish have made a big brain out of that. It's only the cetaceans. And that has been proposed to me by Tony Wright, the guy that from which a lot of this information comes, that is a different lineage. That comes from their... it's difficult to describe. Because they have the ability to produce sonar and to learn to use sonar, they have massively extended juvenility phases. So their bodies stay very, very young and malleable and flexible and growable for huge amounts of time relative to their lifespan. And so they have been able to develop a bigger brain from one generation to the next in order to configure this very, very complicated machinery that they've got in their head. And to some extent, we have a similar pattern in that we have massively extended juvenility phases. And so when a baby is born, its brain can only have got so big inside the mother because it's got to come out of the mother through the pelvis. And so we have a huge stage of learning and growing after our birth so that the brain can continue to expand to its full capacity that would never have been able to get out of the mother. And so we have these massive extended juvenility phases as well, which are undoubtedly part of our sort of generation to generation expansion of the brain over the past 100 million years, say. But another thing that we see, which ties up very nicely with that, is we see now shrinking juvenility phases. Girls are tending to menstruate earlier. People in general are reaching puberty earlier. It's unraveling. The system is uncoiling because the very things that we use, the very combination of elements that we use to produce it, are no longer there.
Yeah, it's like a devolution.
Absolutely
isn't it?
right. Yeah, good word.
And it's interesting that you're kind of like shifting the importance of. Or you're adding weight to the importance of nutrition and evolution, and sort of taking away a little bit from the emphasis on survival of the fittest, and competition and so on.
Yeah, I mean those Darwin's ideas are very, very strong, and they do definitely play a major part in every creature's evolution. But there is also in his original writings, he was very keen to state that as well as the competitive element, there's the cooperative element. And where we're concerned, our evolution comes from the forest, the rainforest, tropical rainforest, where you have permanent flooding of all the right kind of nutrients through constant seasonal fruit. So we have all of those influences upon us, massive chemistry set available to a few creatures that were starting to eat it. And that can't be denied in its influence. So it's not only evolutionary pressure, it's also massive amounts of just the mix of chemistry. And it completely stands to reason that the most complex biological, ecological ecosystem on the planet, tropical rainforests, produce the most complex, compact biological systems, the brain.
So what kind of nutritional elements are we talking about here?
Primarily, we're talking about it's best to understand it as a co-evolution that went on, which is, it can be quite difficult to grasp, but it's got a beautiful poetry about it, that we were evolving in the forest at the same time as the forest was evolving with us in it. And I don't mean us as human beings, I mean us as the great apes. And so as we started to consume more of the fruit-like materials that there were 100 million years ago, we started to influence the fruiting plants. The fruiting plants wanted to attract us to eat their fruit so that we distribute their seeds. And so they started to produce things that we were looking for. And
well, you say wanting, but it's more just natural selection that...
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. Unless you want to believe in a divine force that orchestrates all this for its own entertainment.
Yeah.
Up to you.
Yeah.
But we can talk about it like that too. So the forests are producing things that the apes are wanting to consume, and the apes are distributing the seeds of these fruiting plants. And so as the plant starts to produce things that are more attractive, they're going to be nutritionally more attractive. One of the most obvious things that we find in fruit are sugars. And in order to run a brain that is expanding, you need more sugars. It's the most sugar-hungry object on the planet in our heads. And so there's the attraction loop. And so we grow a bigger brain, we need more fruit. We eat more fruit, we get more sugars, we can grow a bigger brain. There's a whole set of chemical pathways, loops, building loops like that. The amount of antioxidants that you find in fruit, the flavonoids and the chemistry, the steroids, the hormones, the carbolines, all manner of different wonderfully complicated hormone-like materials in fruit that influence our hormones over millions and millions and millions of years.
So that's all established science.
Yeah, it's the kind of science which is chopped up into individual parts. So a primatologist knows that apes eat predominantly fruit, and an endocrinologist knows that flavonoids have an ameliorating effect on the hormones that will build the brain. And a phytologist will know that fruit has lots of flavonoids in it. But because those three disciplines rarely talk to each other, the picture of the flavonoids in fruit being eaten en masse by monkeys, influencing the hormones that build the brain, that picture is still quite broken up in mainstream science. But I've never heard anybody of the highest echelons being able to disrupt that inevitability.
Yeah, surely dietitians should be pulling all this stuff together.
Well, you'd think, wouldn't you?
You'd think so, yeah.
However, you have to bear in mind that dietitians tend to be taught by nutritional schools. Nutritional schools are drawing their information at least from a very entrenched paradigm. And often worse than that, it's entrenched because most nutritional information is paid for, or the research is paid for by the food industry. And so, without becoming too conspiratorial about it, there is an invested interest, both financially and culturally, in us eating the foods that we think we are designed to eat. And this is part of the problem, is we think we're a human being, separate from the rest of evolution. So we don't like to postulate that or draw from the reality that the whole of biology runs on sugars. That is what every cell in your body and every cell out there runs on. And we have an evolution which was developed in synergy with the fruiting plants, where we were consuming masses and masses of fruit. And so we have a sweet tooth, not for a reason, not as an indulgence, not as a weakness, but as an instinct. We are designed to eat masses and masses of sugars. But underlying that, the difference between what makes that a building material for a fueled and funded brain and body, what turns that into a major problem in diabetes and weight gain is that we've stopped eating the fruit that our instincts are driving us to and started to replace that with refined sugars. And so then we have all manner of problems that come out of that. But it's not our call to consume sugars that's wrong, it's where we are answering those calls from. That's critical difference.
You mentioned Tony Wright before, who I've interviewed for the podcast, and when I put it online, one of the comments I got back was from someone who said, okay, well, you know, I've tried a high fruit diet in the past. It didn't work for me. What do you say to people in terms of, you know, those that want to sort of follow this advice with fruit?
Yeah, I mean, it isn't as simple as just eating loads of fruit. There is a huge pathway that we have come from in the past 100,000 years that has left us in a very broken state. We tend to be very undernourished, we tend to be very undermineralized. Our sugar balancing systems all over the place, not only because of our own use of sugars in our own lifetime, but also our parents and our grandparents and their grandparents' use of refined sugars as they've come into our culture in the past 100 or so years. And so just going out there and buying loads, you know, trying to survive on supermarket oranges for the rest of your life, that's not going to work. We're talking about, rather than eating loads of fruit as an idea in itself, is meeting your sugar needs with fruit. So when you want something sweet, eat fruit. That's the best place to start.
Right.
And you'll find from that, having done that for a number of days, weeks, months, years, whatever it is for you, that the call for eating constant amounts of sugar, because that's what the call is about for most people, and we don't recognize it because we put sugars in virtually everything. But that urge to consume sugars all the time starts to take a back seat. It stops being such a driving force, because you're actually satisfying the body's call for sugars. So the idea of putting sugars in every, you know, bolognese sauce and every tomato ketchup bottle, because that's what makes things taste nice, you start separating that out. Don't eat those foods because they contain refined sugars. If you want something sweet, then eat fruit.
So the problem is that we develop this instinct for sweetness, but it wasn't just for the sugar; it was for everything else that came with the sugar in that food, right?
It is, yeah. Yeah, the sugar, you could say, was just like the advertising policy of the fruit.
Yeah.
And along with its colour, for example, is another classic example. We have colour vision in order to spot ripe fruit. It's a good example of its co-evolution. Fruit ripens for us to spot it.
So we need sugar. We have a sweet tooth for a reason. The other two things that, you know, get abused in our mainstream diet now is salt and fat. But again, in the talk that I saw, you say that these things again are essential things that we need. Can you talk about those two?
Yeah, and in the same way that I separate out between sugar, as in refined sugar, and sugars, fruit sugars, sugars held in the natural context of fruit, I also talk about the difference between salt and salts. So when we're talking about salt, we're talking about an empty sodium chloride compound, which doesn't really provide us with anything particular. We use sodium, we use chlorine, we'll get something from it because we're amazing. But our urge to eat salt isn't a requirement for sodium chloride. Our taste buds are set up to detect a whole wealth of mineral salts, is the bigger name for them. So all the vitamins and minerals and that background micronutrient spectrum, that is very subtle. If you're chewing through handfuls of leaves, you're going to get a very subtle sense of it. Whereas a sprinkling of sodium chloride will fool your taste buds into thinking that there's masses of them there, because your taste buds can't differentiate. And so putting salt on food is simply a way of making us eat it. It doesn't produce more of the nutrients that the body's looking for in there. It just makes your taste buds light up. And so if we are... Most people can have some relationship to this in celery. Celery is very naturally salty. It contains masses of some of the right balance of electrolytes and mineral salts. And that's the kind of level of saltiness that we are expecting. So you can understand why a tablespoon of salt tastes fantastic for your taste buds, because it proposes to them that there's masses of mineral salts in here. So when you're eating foods that have masses of natural mineral salts and vitamins and minerals in them, and the body's getting everything that it needs along that level, and so the call to eat very, very salty foods tend to die away. Again, it takes a back seat. Whereas when you are attempting to meet your need for saltiness with salt, from which your body gets none of those vitamins and minerals, the urge to eat more salts remains, and so you continue to consume masses of salt. That's when salt starts to build up in the system. You need masses of water to keep it soluble in the body. You clog up the kidneys. You run into the problems that are associated with salt rather than the benefits that are associated with salts. In the same way that sugar has massive problems with diabetes and weight gain, whereas sugars, from their natural source in their natural context, have masses of benefits. And the other one along those lines is fats. Fats and oils are so fundamentally essential to the body that you would die if you maintained a fat-free diet for very long, because your cells, every one of your cells, has to have a fatty layer around it that repels water. So the inside of the cell stays inside and the outside of the cell stays outside. But there are certain systems in your body that require fats for myriad different reasons, not least of which is your inflammatory system, and most importantly, I would say, is your nervous system, which all those nerve endings terminate in the brain, and your brain, this most complex, most compact biological scene on the planet, is populated by about 80% fat. And it's not chicken lard, it's not, vegetable oil. This is highly rarefied oils that you would have found naturally in the forest. And to make sure you find them, your body has evolved a gallbladder in the digestive system, whose sole purpose is to optimize the uptake of fats when you come across them. So all of those biological realities that can't be denied are saying to us, we need the right kinds of fats. So we have taste buds we have taste sensations that are very satisfied when we consume fatty foods, because your body's looking for the right kinds of fats. But you can create that same sensation by eating lard. You can make any food very fatty and you'll get that same taste sensation and that same sense of satisfaction, but you won't necessarily be able to utilize those fats because they aren't what your body was expecting that you found in the forest over hundreds of millions of years.
So effectively, we've ruined our taste, our sense, which was something that was used by the body to keep it well nourished, and we've just used it as a pleasure circuit, aren't we? We season foods, we put all this stuff in it just to hit this pleasure circuit, and we're just destroying our sense of taste, which
Absolutely.
is a sense after all.
Absolutely, it's exactly what we've done. Instead of using our taste to define what we're eating, we use taste to define what we're eating. There's a subtle difference in the words, but it's a profound difference biologically. We're now just flavouring foods to please our palate, regardless of what it does for our nutrition, which is backwards. But then we would expect it to be backwards because our brains are built of lard and chicken fat. Yeah.
You've mentioned that supermarkets project false diversity, and it's really the same 10 nutrients on display in the food there. You explain that a little bit more.
Yeah, it's to do with agriculture, and you can get dark about it and see it as a requirement of the food industry and therefore the agricultural industry. That if you were to take 100 products, 100 top-selling products, for example, from a supermarket, and turn them all over and look at the back, look at the ingredients, you'd find 90-95% of the material that is in front of you is made of whey, gluten, maize, fructose syrup, rice, millet. I think what the others would be, but that's about it. It's very, very, very few food groups that have been diversified, mostly as bulking agents and flavouring agents, to populate our supermarket shelves in ways that seem diverse.
So it's a great fit for industrial food production and retailing, but it's not so good a fit for human nutrition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Any nutritionist, their top line should be diversity is king. And this comes from the fact that every other animal out there seeks and eats different foods at different times. Rather than eating the same 10 foods every meal, every day, it eats one food that time, one food that time, one food that time. And when it comes back to that same food a month later, it's out of season. So it is forced to eat something different. Its diet is constantly changing. And in that way, the nutrients that are coming in are constantly changing as well. So you have a diversity of flow. And there's a whole other layer to that as well, in that all foods contain not only nutrients, but also poisons.
Oh, yeah.
Plants aren't designed to be eaten. Plants are, a spinach leaf is designed to photosynthesize for the spinach plant. The fact that we eat it and call it food is not of no concern to the spinach, except that we're eating spinach leaves and it doesn't want us to. And so over millions of years of evolution, plants have learned to protect themselves. So they produce poisons.
Yeah.
And
well, I was eating spinach every day for breakfast because to sort of try and get well and recover from chronic illness. And there was me thinking it was a good thing. And I've recently learned that it has a high histamine content, and I seem to have an issue with histamine. So I've cut that out, and I'm feeling a lot better, which it's interesting you mentioned that. So is spinach a particularly defensive plant?
No, I mentioned spinach because most people... So what I'm trying to do when I do this part of the talk on the retreats, what I'm trying to do is pull the rug out from under the language that we use around food. We tend to, and you did the same as we all do, you tend to think of a food as good for you or bad for you. And the reality is it is both. There are nutrients in all foods and there are poisons in all foods. So the reason I choose spinach is that most people think of it as good for you. And many of the people that come on retreat with me have read that, there's lots of wonderful iron content in spinach, for example. And so it's classified as a food that's good for you. But if you go into further reading into the sort of self-help naturopathy world, you'll also at some point read that spinach has lots of oxalic acid in it, as all the chard family do. And oxalic acid is known to be problematic. It can form kidney stones, and it's a poison. It's a defense. And so I use that to undermine this idea that a food is either good for us or bad for us. It's a very difficult point to undermine because we are so programmed to use that judgmental language around things. But it's really not helpful, especially around foods. So when I talk about spinach in that way, it's really just as a good example of what I'm trying to do with it. But it's true of all plants. And your example is particularly poignant in what I was saying before, in that when you eat one type of food every day, you are quickly getting topped up on all of the nutrients that are available in that food, and you probably don't need any of them for a while. But you're also getting topped up on all the poisons that are in that food. And your body, over the course of evolution, has learned to turn off many of these poisons that come in. So your immune system is capable of producing antigens that neutralize these poisons. But if you keep hitting the same digestive system with the same poisons and the body is forced to produce the same antigens all the time, that gland that produces them will get worn out. They will get faulty. And so those poisons will then start to make their way into the system and generate intolerances, i.e. the body's overloaded on that poison right now. And so the way that we eat naturally, or we would have eaten naturally like all the other animals, is by switching them about all the time. So not only does the digestive system get a rest in terms of what it's trying to digest, but the wing of the immune system that sits in the digestive system is also getting a rest of what it's defending against all the time. And so it puts another hole in the argument that we should be eating this 4 square meal idea. Get all your proteins, all your starches, all of your fats, and all of your sugars in every single meal. No other animal has attempted to do that. It's madness to do so.
So we should keep a variation. We should eat one thing at a time, ideally, and we should eat things that our body has evolved to create antigens against.
Variety is the spice of life. It's a big phrase. That's worth a lot, that one. But also, yeah, like you say, it's a completely different way of seeing foods, and it creates a completely different food landscape. In that, it takes so long, talking potentially 1,000,000 years, for your body to produce a whole different antigen to a poison that's coming across in food. So if suddenly we start introducing foods that we've never eaten before in the course of evolution, then we don't have the antigens to those poisons. And so this understanding starts to generate a different landscape of what is a natural food for human beings. What would we naturally be eating? And therefore, what do we naturally have the antigens for? And the answer is monkey food. And we don't like that answer, on the whole, because we're human beings. We aren't monkeys. We're much more grandiose and arrogant. So that information isn't very well received. That's the biggest problem with the argument.
And as you say, if we can't go back to the forest and live as monkeys, then we can at least, if we want to, take a step in that direction, if we want to improve our health.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the thing to take from this isn't so much, okay, so we should just be eating fruit. That's not the case at all. Make sure you're getting your sweet urge, which your sweet tooth is telling you about, your instinct. Make sure you satisfy that with fruit. And you'll find that then your calling for sugar goes away in all the other, muesli bars and apple pies and ketchup. All of that starts to fall off the list. And so you haven't massively increased the amount of sugars coming into your system. You've just changed the context of the sugars coming into your system. And the same is true with fats. I don't suggest that people go out and suddenly start necking bottles of olive oil. What I'm saying is your urge to eat fats is an instinct. So make sure the fats that you're eating are proper fats. So cold-pressed fats, cold-pressed oils, so you don't heat them.
Okay, one last question. Sorry, one last thing before we get on to your work at the retreat centre. What happens when we drink coffee? I briefly read a little bit about, or saw you talk about this. I think it could quite help me finally kick it. Possibly, we'll see. We'll see.
Right. Well, coffee is a fantastic example of what I've just been saying in terms of the poisons in food. So if you've ever sat at a coffee bush, you will recognise that if you pull off those little red berries and eat them, they're bloody horrible. And that is the plant's first defence to say, go away, eat something else. I don't want you to eat my babies.
Who does eat coffee? Does anybody eat coffee raw?
There it is, I rest my case.
No animals?
As far as I'm aware, I've not seen anything that says any animals eat coffee.
I read a story about goats eating them and then skipping off, bounding down a hill once. It could have been rubbish, but yeah, I read that.
Hyperactive goats, brilliant.
Yeah.
And actually, you've just reminded me that I saw on QI a while back that there is a type of very expensive coffee that you can buy that has been processed through a certain type of squirrel.
Oh, civet.
That's the one.
Civet
That's
coffee.
The one. Yeah. So the civet eats the coffee seed. The coffee fruit, and it's probably heading for something that may be quite useful in the soft layer on the coffee seeds, and then it poops out the coffee seed itself, so it doesn't chew it up.
Yeah.
So it doesn't get the bitter, acrid saponins that are in the coffee. They go out the other end, and then you make coffee from it, if that's your proclivity. So what the civet is avoiding there is the poisons that are inside the seed, and this is how. This is a fantastic example of this sort of evolutionary arms race. So the plant has produced a material, a set of very powerful alkaloids in the seed to stop animals eating its seeds, so that its seeds produce more plants, which is what they're for. And human beings have come along and found that if you take these seeds and you process them in this way and that way, how that was found out, I have no idea. But where we are today is you consume coffee, and the poisons that are in coffee, the most obvious one being caffeine, but there are over 2,000 other very poisonous materials on coffee seeds. The coffee, your body has no evolutionary precedent for. It hasn't seen it for long enough, even if it was 100,000 years. That's probably not long enough for your body to see this material for the poison that it is and equip your immune system to oxidize it, to neutralize it. And so because we've got no defences against it, the caffeine comes into the body, into the bloodstream, and is then highlighted as a poison in the blood by the immune system. And your whole endocrine system is then cranked up in order to push the blood through the liver as fast as possible to clean the blood of this very, very poisonous material. So that the hit on your endocrine system, which elevates the blood pressure and massively increases heart rate in order to get the blood through the liver as fast as possible, that's the hit that you feel out of coffee. That's the wake-up that you feel from coffee. And then the liver is stripping out caffeine from the blood, and eventually the liver gets saturated in caffeine, and the liver doesn't like caffeine any more than the blood does. And so it goes into convulsions, producing masses of excess bile to dilute and remove this caffeine content from the liver. And that's the holistic use of coffee. People have been using coffee for hundreds of years to purge the liver. And that's what it's about. It literally wrings it out. And as it's producing all this excess bile to get rid of the caffeine, it will also knock out a bit of junk that's held in the liver as well, giving it a cleanse. That caffeine and its related toxins are going then into the small intestine, down the bile duct from the liver. And the small intestines don't like it either. And so the small intestines go into convulsion to get rid of it. And that's the deconstipating effects of coffee. So all of that is a crisis management routine to get rid of such a poisonous material.
But there are antioxidants and some good stuff in there.
It's a plant.
Yeah.
It works with oxygen. It will contain antioxidants.
Right, right.
Everything does. Every structure that works with antioxidants, that works with oxygen, will have antioxidants, because oxygen itself is a ferocious material that needs chaperoning, and the antioxidants do that. But there you go. So again, perfect example. The coffee contains caffeine, which is a horrendous poison that creates this massive crisis panic system in the endocrine system. But coffee will also contain antioxidants. It's a nutrient. So it does contain some benefits, and it also contains massive problems, like all foods will.
So despite its initial protestations by, saying don't eat me and, this horrible taste, we have used it, we've found a use for it, and it's now, as a plant, I guess, become even more successful because we've cultivated it and planted it. Mm-hmm. So in a way, there is a symbiosis there, isn't there?
Yeah, in that we are we are squeezing the coffee plants to do what we want them to do. So I wouldn't so much call that a symbiosis as a use of. But I get where you're coming from. There are now probably many, many more coffee bushes on the planet than there would have been. However, the coffee bush can't evolve for its own benefits. It is evolving for what we squeeze it to do. So you may well find that in a couple of hundred years, when all the human beings have toasted themselves off the planet, all the coffee bushes will die off because they now require us to do things for them.
So coffee could completely die away in that scenario?
I've got no evidence to support that particular example. I'm just using a dramatic way of saying it to point to the fact that it's not an evolution in its for its own benefit. It's an evolution for what we want it to do. You could say the same thing about GMO corn. There's much more corn on the planet than there ever was in the past. But you take the human beings away, and most of those corn crops are going to die away.
Yeah, it's come to the end of its evolution in a sense, now that we've stepped in and started to do these things.
Exactly. We've forced the end of its evolution by curtailing it to our needs.
Right. So if we're to avoid the end of our own evolution, there's... First of all, we're pretty toxic. We want to switch to a healthier diet. You run detoxes, don't you? A week-long detox, is it? Yeah, that's right. It's a 7-day detox, and I've been doing it for 20 years, and it's evolved a lot in that time. In that initially my vigour with it, my passion with it, came from the detox itself. It's an opportunity to clean out the colon of all the rubbish that's in there, since which I find doesn't really exist. There's no such thing as mucoid plaque, because we can see now inside the colons that we didn't have the equipment to see 100 years ago when this information was first born. So that kind of took the wind out of what is a detox about then. I know it still works. People feel fantastic afterwards. So what is that about? And that spurred me to dig much deeper into what detox is. And so
we're using very, very dilute juice with people. So people almost are consuming nothing. And in that way, the body is forced to dig into its own resources, to drill into its own stores of nutrients in order to survive that process. And that's the beauty of detox, in that it enables the body to free up lots of junk in that drilling process. And how the pancreas works in that process, it fuels the immune system to clear the blood rather than constantly fueling the digestive system to consume food. It's all biological standards. It's all absolutely certified biological information. And that works wonders. But what another layer that has become more apparent to me in doing the detoxes with people is that the healing that does, that is fantastic. That all goes on. But the main thing that people get from it is just a bloody good rest. We are so stressed and so on all the time that our systems are frying. And I don't just mean in terms of work stresses and telephones ringing and family pressures and social pressures and all of that. I mean also the massive pressure that we put ourselves under from eating the foods that we eat. And so when you go into a safe bubble in which, like a retreat, where you have no external pressures, there's nothing you have to do. You don't have to be at any particular time at any particular place. There are lots of things on offer throughout the day, and you don't have to do any of them. And so people rest in a very, very deep way. Plus the fact that there's no food coming in means that the whole physiology goes into a very deep state of release. And from that, in that place, lots of stuff bubbles up. Emotional stuff, perspective stuff, even neurological shifts. People start to become very clear, very sensitized, very aware of where they are and where they want to be in their lives. And so it becomes potentially a massive life change for people. It very much depends on what people are there to do. Most people, I would say, are there to just come along and lose some weight and get their energy back and maybe kickstart their food story. And that's fine, that's what they get. But those that come, and they don't always know it beforehand, those that come and are willing to look beyond that into where they actually are in their lives and where they want to be in their lives, that's massive, massive shift.
Because then you have a life coach there on hand as well.
That's right, yeah. We've been, Kate has been working with us for many, many years. She's a life coach and a homeopath. I've never met anybody that has the capacity to unveil someone to themselves just by asking questions about what they are saying. It's a profound, profound effect, and it can't be done it can't be done to the same extent outside of the retreat process because we've still got all our boundaries up. It's one of my great joys in the retreat work is watching people arrive on the Friday night with their armour on, and then after 2 or 3 days, the armour falling away and people starting to engage with each other on much more intimate levels, speaking about things that they would not speak about with anybody other than their closest consorts.
Yeah, I've seen that in communal living, like at Ecoforest where we were,
absolutely,
and, and all the other communities I've visited, and anywhere where a group of people is involved in doing something like this.
Well, that's the other part of it. It is you're sharing an event, so everybody starts the retreat at the same time and finishes the retreat at the same time, and so you are sharing a journey together. And whereas at Ecoforest, where we were 15 or 20 years ago, whatever it was weeks and weeks of stay together, and people unfolded at that time frame. But because you've got the lack of external pressures, you've got no food in the system driving the stimulus from there, the relaxation and the communality comes out much more readily. It's beautiful. And so I use that. This is where the real juice is for me. So the healing all happens from the detox, and you get this wonderful emotional landscape that becomes possible. But for me, I use that time to hit everybody for 2 hours every day with this kind of nutritional information. And because people are much more naturally open and willing to explore things, this information goes so much deeper. And in that way, I feel like I'm actually doing a service. And I was troubled for a long time in bringing people into the retreats, and they go through this fantastic process, get much clearer, much cleaner in themselves, and then they go back out into the world and do exactly the same things and come back next year. And what the retreats allow me to do is nail home this nutritional information, which points to the fact that you only need to do something as stupid as a detox because you're eating stupid things.
Yeah.
So it starts to tie itself together into a longer term plan for people. And it's not about making raw fooders, it's about making conscious eaters.
So go on. Sorry.
Go on.
Sorry, finish the point.
Well, just that if you want, most people in heavy, stressful, busy city life situations can't afford to be bright, open, vulnerable, exposed, emotional beings. You have to be sort of hackled down. You have to be thick-skinned. And so when you start eating more lighter foods, then you start to feel more exposed and more vulnerable and more sensitive. And that starts to then impact your choice of how often you go down the pub, what TV programs you watch, which foods you're hanging out with, which foods you're eating, what you're watching on telly, and what job you're doing. And so it becomes an entire life shift for some people, for people that are willing to do it. Or you recognise the values of eating potato meals, because they do close you down, and you need to be closed down in order to work in that crazy environment. So it becomes a more conscious set of choices. Your food choices become the tools to enable you to live the life you want to live. And of course the question comes up, do you want to live in a stressful, busy, bombarding environment that requires you to suppress the functions of the body? Do you want to live in an environment that requires anesthetics to live there? That's profound.
Yeah.
That's a bit better than cleaning out the colon.
And you're called Sura Detox, and you're in Devon on the south coast of England.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Most people catch the train to us. It takes about 3 hours to get there, and then we pick them up from the train station. It's all very sort of smooth and easy these days, but it's a big leap for people to take. The idea of not having food for a week, that's a commitment in itself.
Yeah. It's a beautiful rural location, is it? It's
about 30 acres of fields and planted forest and ancient forest, and there's a swimming pool and a sauna, and we do guided walks around the place. It's gorgeous. You can't hear any cars. All you can hear is birds. There's lakes and rivers, and it's exquisite. And that's the first thing that people receive is that kind of, no cars, no sirens, no telephones. We have full broadband throughout. You can still communicate with the world. But in terms of your sensory impact, it's massively relaxing.